Charlotte Blackwood had just given birth to the long-awaited child when her husband James, a multimillionaire CEO, entered the hospital room with divorce papers and his red-dressed mistress. What James didn't know was that Charlotte wasn't just the perfect wife he had married for love. She was also the secret daughter of Britain's most powerful business magnate, a woman who had renounced her empire for love, but was now ready to reclaim everything. In 48 hours, Charlotte Blackwood transformed the most painful betrayal of her life into the most spectacular revenge London had ever witnessed. The Portland Hospital in London's West End had never witnessed such a luxurious birth. The presidential suite overflowed with expensive flowers. Dom Perignon champagne waited on the table, and the view embraced all of London like a golden kingdom. Charlotte Blackwood, 28 years old, held little Oliver in her arms whilst tears of joy streamed down her face. After 3 years of marriage and 2 miscarriages that had shattered her soul, she finally held against her chest the miracle she had waited for. The delicate scent of the newborn mingled with the aroma of white flowers filling the room, creating an atmosphere of purity and hope that seemed to bless this perfect moment. James Blackwood, 35 years old, CEO of Blackwood Holdings with a fortune of £500 million, was not present. The hospital corridor had become his makeshift office, where billion-pound negotiations were discussed with the same urgency he should have reserved for his son's birth. Charlotte had learned to accept this cruel reality. Being the wife of Britain's fourth richest man meant always living in second place. But when the door opened and James entered with an expression she had never seen before, the atmosphere of the room changed instantly. Behind him walked a woman Charlotte recognized immediately, Valentina Sterling, 26 years old, model and influencer. The red dress she wore seemed like a bloodstain against the white purity of the room where a child had just been born. James extracted an envelope of legal papers from his jacket with mechanical movements, like a businessman closing an unpleasant deal. The words he spoke cut through the air like ice. The marriage was over. The child wasn't his. He had already signed the divorce papers. Charlotte looked incredulously at the paternity tests on the bedside table. Mathematically perfect, scientifically unquestionable, whilst James ignored them with the contempt of one who had already decided his own truth. Valentina approached the bed with the lethal grace of a serpent, her expensive perfume seeming to contaminate the pure air of the room. Little Oliver began to cry, as if his tiny heart felt the devastation befalling his family before he'd even had the chance to know it. James didn't spare him a glance whilst informing Charlotte that she had 48 hours to vacate the manor house. When the door closed behind James and Valentina, who left hand in hand as if they had just become parents instead of destroying a family, Charlotte remained alone in the luxurious suite that had suddenly become a gilded prison. Tears fell onto Oliver's face whilst she rocked him, whispering words of comfort that were more for herself than for him. But what James and Valentina didn't know, whilst they celebrated their victory in the hospital corridors, was that Charlotte Blackwood had never truly existed. She was merely a character that Charlotte Ashworth had played for 3 years out of love. And now the real Charlotte was about to awaken. That night, in her hospital room, engulfed in London's silence, Charlotte didn't sleep a wink. Whilst Oliver slept peacefully in his cot, she stared at the ceiling with eyes that no longer wept. Rage had replaced pain. Clarity had erased despair. At dawn, she made a telephone call she hadn't made for 3 years. The voice that answered belonged to Lord Henry Ashworth, 65 years old, Britain's most powerful man whom nobody knew. Whilst newspapers celebrated puppets like James Blackwood, Henry moved markets from the shadows with a simple gesture. 3 years earlier, Charlotte had chosen love over power. She had renounced the Ashworth name to become Blackwood, had rejected billions to marry a man she believed loved her for who she was. Henry had never forgiven her that choice, but blood was blood. Charlotte recounted everything with a steady voice. The betrayal, the humiliation, the inhuman way James had ignored his newborn grandson. Every word fed a silent fire growing in the old patriarch's soul. When she finished, Henry emitted that dry laugh his enemies in business had learned to fear more than any threat. But Charlotte's response surprised him. She didn't want him to destroy James out of revenge. She wanted to do it herself, with her own hands, with her intelligence, with all the power she had inherited from Ashworth blood. Whilst she spoke with her father, social media exploded with photos of James and Valentina leaving the hospital, smiling at the paparazzi. The newspaper headlines hurt her more than any slap. James described the marriage with her as a youthful mistake, and declared he had never felt a true emotional connection with Charlotte. Neither of them mentioned Oliver, as if the child were an inconvenient detail to be erased from the narrative of their love story. Reading those words, Charlotte wrote the message that would change everything. 8 words sent to 3 numbers representing her war alliance. I am ready to come home. Let's begin. The recipients were her father Henry, her sister Penelope, who ran international operations, and Marcus Campbell, Britain's most ruthless corporate lawyer, the man who had always loved her and had waited 3 years for her to realize her mistake. Within an hour, intercontinental calls crossed between London, New York, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. Contracts were dusted off, alliances reactivated, favors called in. James Blackwood believed he had married a sweet girl who would submit to his betrayal with dignity. Instead, he had just awakened the heiress of Britain's most powerful empire, and Charlotte Ashworth was about to remind him what it meant to declare war on the wrong family. 24 hours after Charlotte's text message, James Blackwood awoke in his Mayfair penthouse with the sensation that something was terribly wrong. The air itself seemed electric, charged with a tension he couldn't explain. The Asian markets had been open for hours, and what he saw on his screens made him break into a cold sweat. Blackwood Holdings shares were plummeting in free fall without apparent reason. Someone was selling massively with surgical precision. Major investors were withdrawing capital as if the company had become radioactive. Panic exploded through desperate calls. The bank had frozen all corporate accounts for a tax investigation that had emerged from nowhere overnight. Contracts with Chinese suppliers had been mysteriously cancelled. Those with Latin America fell under investigation for alleged corruption. The European Commission opened an investigation into their most profitable patents. The final blow came from Ashworth Industries, which represented 40% of his turnover. The voice on the other end of the telephone was cold as tempered steel. All contracts were terminated immediately for strictly personal and non-negotiable reasons. James began to suspect these weren't coincidences, but it was impossible. Charlotte was just a sweet girl he had married for love. She had no power, no dangerous connections. His assistant entered in panic, showing a tablet with trembling hands. On every British channel, Charlotte's image with Oliver dominated the screens. But this wasn't the Charlotte Blackwood he knew. This was someone completely different. A woman radiating power and authority as if she were born to command. The newsreader announced that Charlotte Ashworth, heiress to the Ashworth Industries empire, was returning to the business world after 3 years of voluntary absence. She would assume operational control of all group companies. James collapsed into his chair, feeling the world crumble with the precision of a controlled demolition. Charlotte wasn't the innocent girl he thought he had married. She was the heiress to one of Europe's most powerful empires. The telephone rang. It was Charlotte, and the voice that came from the receiver was unrecognizable, cold, confident, lethal. "Hello, James. Are you enjoying your day?" In the days that followed that telephone call, London witnessed the most spectacular collapse in its recent financial history. James Blackwood, who a week earlier had controlled a £500 million empire, found himself picking up the pieces of a life disintegrating hour by hour. Valentina vanished like morning mist as soon as advertising contracts dried up, and her reputation in the fashion world became toxic.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
He had seen her for the last time whilst packing, accusing him of dragging her into an impossible war against the Princess of Britain's most powerful legal mafia. The cruelest blow came when James discovered that the manor house where he had lived with Charlotte had never been his. It had always belonged to Ashworth Industries, loaned to Charlotte as a personal dowry. Now that the marriage was over, she was exercising her property rights. 24 hours to vacate the house he had believed he owned. Whilst packing his belongings like a thief in his own home, James understood this too was part of Charlotte's plan. She had always known that one day she could reclaim everything. She had married a man who thought he controlled her, whilst in reality she had always managed every aspect of their shared life. The newspapers recounted every detail of his downfall like a live soap opera. From business prince to suburban pauper, the perfect revenge of Charlotte Ashworth blazoned across every magazine in the country. But the most painful moment came seeing Charlotte's photos in the international press. She was no longer the shy girl he had married. She had become a woman of absolute power, elegant and confident, beautiful in a way he had never noticed when he had her beside him every day. Forbes featured her on the cover. Charlotte Ashworth, Britain's most powerful woman, is also the world's most determined mother. In the photos she held Oliver whilst signing contracts, inaugurating corporate headquarters, being interviewed as a visionary leader of modern business. The final blow came with a handwritten letter delivered to the suburban studio where he now survived. Charlotte's elegant handwriting that he knew so well now traced words of definitive farewell. The letter explained that his destroyed company, his reputation in ashes, his non-existent social life weren't Charlotte's revenge. They were simply the consequences of his choices. The real revenge was that he now knew who she really was and realized what he had thrown away. The woman who could have made him Britain's most powerful man. He had chosen a superficial model instead of the mother of his child. Now he lived with the consequences forever. James finished reading and wept for the first time. Not for the lost money, not for the destroyed company, but for the consciousness that he had destroyed with his own hands the most precious thing in his life. It was too late for everything. 2 years after that betrayal which had changed everything, London observed fascinated the unstoppable rise of Charlotte Ashworth. She was no longer just a successful businesswoman. She had become the living symbol of how a betrayed woman could transform the deepest suffering into the most spectacular victory. Little Oliver, now 2 years old, often accompanied his mother to the most important events. Photographers adored him. A beautiful child with lively eyes who held the hand of Britain's most powerful woman. Nobody dared mention James Blackwood in their presence. He had become a ghost of the past, a mistake nobody spoke of anymore. The manor house, where the failed marriage had once lived, had been transformed into a center of excellence for single mothers in difficulty. Charlotte had personally supervised every detail, transforming painful memories into concrete hope for hundreds of other women facing betrayal and abandonment. Marcus Campbell, the lawyer who had demolished James's empire, had become a constant presence in Charlotte's life. Not as a lover, but as a trusted advisor, as the man who had always believed in her potential. One afternoon, watching Oliver play in the garden, Marcus said something that made her reflect. He was proud of her, because she could have simply destroyed James out of revenge. Instead, she had built something beautiful from the ruins of her suffering. It was true. Every pound taken from James had been reinvested in social projects. Every company acquired during the Blackwood Empire's collapse had become a model of excellence. Every personal victory had transformed into an opportunity for other women to redeem themselves. Charlotte tenderly called her son, who ran to her with that luminous smile that made every sacrifice worthwhile. She took him in her arms, feeling the perfect weight of her new life. When Oliver asked if he would have a company like hers when he grew up, Charlotte smiled and taught him the most important lesson. True power isn't what you take from others to hurt them. It's what you build to make the world better. In the distance, London's lights lit up like stars celebrating the rebirth of a woman who had transformed the most painful betrayal into the most spectacular victory of her generation. 3 years after the betrayal, on a London spring day, Charlotte received an unexpected call. James was in hospital, a heart attack at 40. The doctors said he probably wouldn't survive the night, and he had asked to see her. Charlotte remained silent for long minutes. Oliver, now 3 years old, was drawing intently at their new home's kitchen table. When he asked if she was all right, she simply replied that she had to visit someone from her past, who was ill. St. Tits. Bartholomew's Hospital was very different from the luxurious clinic where Oliver had been born. The smell of disinfectant and fluorescent lights created an atmosphere of resignation. James was in room 204, connected to machines keeping alive what remained of the man who had once believed himself invincible. When Charlotte entered, he opened his eyes, and time seemed to stop. She had come, he whispered with a broken voice. She replied that he had always been too proud to die quietly. James asked about Oliver. Charlotte told him he was well, that he was intelligent and brave, everything a son should be. He had his eyes, his nose, probably the same stubborn heart. James finally wept, admitting he had been a fool. He had thrown away the most beautiful thing in his life out of vanity. Valentina had left him as soon as the money ran out. It had never been love. When he asked if she could ever have forgiven him, Charlotte remained silent for a long time. Then she said she had already forgiven him, but forgiveness didn't erase consequences. He had made choices, and she had had to live with those choices. Oliver had grown up without a father because of those choices. When James asked if it was too late to know his son, Charlotte replied with pitiless gentleness that yes, it was too late. Oliver didn't know who he was, and never would. It was better that way. James accepted the verdict he had earned. He said he was proud of what she had become, how she had raised their son, how she had transformed everything into something beautiful. Charlotte stayed with him until the end, holding his hand whilst life slowly ebbed away, not out of love, not out of pity, but because nobody should die alone. When it was all over, she returned home where Oliver waited with a drawing, a happy family composed of a mummy and a child, smiling under a golden sun. Charlotte looked at that drawing and understood she had won everything that truly mattered. Not revenge, not James's destruction, but the construction of a new and meaningful life for herself and her son. That evening, whilst Oliver slept, Charlotte approached the window and gazed at London shining in the night. Every light represented a possibility, a dream, a life that continued despite everything. She had transformed the most painful betrayal into the most beautiful victory, becoming the mother and woman she had always wanted to be, without compromises, without regrets. And this, more than any revenge, was the true triumph of Charlotte Ashworth. If this story has touched your heart, smash that like button and share to show that a mother's love is the most powerful force in the world. Tell us, what would you have done in Charlotte's place? Do you think revenge is ever justified? Subscribe for more incredible stories of rebirth, revenge, and love that always triumphs.